Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you're joining us from. My name is Yulia Ivanuk, and I'm the coordinator of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the University of Manitoba. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dana peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the Center's first lecture of the 2022-23 series, a webinar on a very timely topic, as we are continuing to dispel myths about Ukraine. Credits earned by attending the QX lectures and book club sessions can be used towards claiming a letter of participation in Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Studies. We are honored to be joined by Alexandre Fontaine today to discuss his book, Talking to Ukrainians, an Outsider's Perspective, and to be joined by Senator Donna Descos, who has kindly agreed to provide an introduction to the topic. Donna Descos was appointed to the Senate of Canada by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on June 6, 2018. She's a respected national pollster, media commentator, and private sector business leader with considerable public policy expertise. She holds a PhD and MA from the University of Toronto. Senator Descos was formerly Senior Vice President of Environics Research Group Limited and built the firm from a very small consultancy into one of Canada's leading research firms. She served in many leadership roles as director or chair of several organizations, including the United Way of Greater Toronto, the Canadian Unity Council, GreenPAC, and others. For 3 decades, she has advocated for more women in elected politics as co-founder and national chair of Equal Voice, and now in the Senate, where she continues her advocacy. She's a distinguished fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and taught in its master's program before her Senate appointment. She's a member of Statistics Canada's Advisory Committee on Social Conditions as well. Senator Descos was born and raised in Winnipeg. She resides in Toronto and represents Ontario in the Senate. Without further ado, Senator Descos, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Yulia, and I'm really pleased to be here today to introduce Alexandre Fontaine, who's written a short book about his observations in Ukraine. I also want to add, I'm a graduate of the University of Manitoba as well. I got a BA honors there a few decades ago. And I also just want to add that, I am Ukrainian background on my father's side. And I never learned Ukrainian at home. My mother's Polish background, I didn't learn Polish either. But when I was a student at the University of Manitoba, I graduated with a BA degree. And then I came back a couple of years later to teach at the University of Manitoba in the sociology department. And I said it's time for me to learn some Ukrainian. So I actually took a Ukrainian course from your department, the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies. It may have had a different name then, I don't know, but for better or worse, all the Ukrainian I know has been learned from your department. Not that much, I haven't remembered very much. This is a long time ago, but that was, so thank you for imparting at least some Ukrainian language to me a few decades ago. So I'm really happy to be here to be part of this. In the early morning of February 24th, Vladimir Putin launched a brazen and unprovoked attack on Ukraine in an effort to destroy the independence of this peaceful, free, and democratic country. NATO Secretary Jens Stoltenberg declared at the time that we now have war in Europe. This invasion of Ukraine threatens the international order, it threatens the rule of law, and it threatens democracy. The Ukrainians have fought back bravely, or especially over the last short while since February, but there most certainly has been a tremendous destruction in Ukraine. And it's very, very sad for all of us in Canada and throughout the world to see what has happened in Ukraine. Now, Alexandre Fontaine has written a short book of his observations of Ukraine, and he describes himself as a Canadian, an outsider, he says, who lived in Ukraine for 6 months. And his book was published earlier this year. And I just want to quote a couple of things he says. Among his observations when it comes to Europe, he says, and I quote, "Of all the countries I have ever visited, worked, or transited through, I have rarely, if ever, seen so much pain that is largely no fault of their own." And Alexander says this before the invasion of Ukraine. He says these words before Ukraine was invaded by the Russians in February. And yet, Alexandre Fontaine also says, and I quote, "Ukrainians are some of the most resilient and hardworking people that I have had the privilege to meet." And my aim was to explain how a nation with terrible odds has become able to overcome them. And we can only hope and pray that this is so. So on that note, let me turn over this space to Mr. Fontaine. Thank you very much. Дякую.
Thank you so much, Senator Driscoll, for your important remarks and for taking the time from your busy schedule to join us here today. It was an honor to have you join this webinar. I'm pleased to welcome our speaker for today, Alexandre Fontaine. Alexandre was part of the Government of Canada's assistance mission to Ukraine, having lived in country for over 6 months. During his 14 years at the Department of National Defense, Alexandre served in overseas deployments that include Afghanistan, Central Africa, and Eastern Europe. Holding degrees from Concordia University and the University of Manitoba, Alexandre recently graduated with his Master's of Liberal Arts from Harvard University. All profits generated from his book, Talking to Ukrainians, are directly donated to Ukrainian charities. So if you have not yet had a chance to read it, please make sure to get a copy and familiarize yourself with this important work. Alexandre, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Julia. And to all of you, thank you as well for being here. I know that Senator Dusko had to leave, although if her camera's still on, thank you for those kind remarks. They're far too kind. Very much. Thank you, ma'am. Also, just to make sure, Julia, can everyone see my screen where it says Talk Ukraine, Subtitle Perspective? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So what I'm going to discuss today is what I saw and what I lived through while I was in Ukraine, with some caveats throughout. The picture you see here, that's just Lviv, the first time I was there. All the pictures that you're going to see are pictures that I took, so that's why they're not mentioned or the source of origins. They're all from my own camera skills, limited as they may be. And so now if I can only get the mouse to turn. And there we go. Okay, so what we're going to be talking about today briefly. I'm going to give you some disclaimers and cautions. So who I'm talking about, what I'm talking about, who I'm representing, and especially who I'm not. Very important, because I can't speak on behalf of many departments. And then in what I wrote, I divided it into conversations, an overview. So I give a background story, and then what I do is I'll explain through conversations with people I've had for 3 or 4 months. This is what a person called Piotr or Sasha or Anna, and I divide themes of what you see in Ukraine based on conversations I've had with people. And what that turns into is understanding their values and ethics. So what exactly is important to Ukrainians, what is not? I realize for those of Ukrainian origin, I will say things that you'll probably not agree with. And that's because I'm not Ukrainian. So that's very much why I call it Talking to Ukrainians, an outsider's perspective. Then I'm going to talk to you about obstacles. I'm going to talk about 2 types. So I'm going to talk about obstacles that are internal to Ukraine, of which there's really nothing that an outsider can do. That's up to Ukraine to find solutions to problems. And of course, I will talk about the elephant in the room, which is to say obstacles that are outside of Ukraine, and it would be impossible for me to even touch that without discussing the Russian Federation of that. And I'll leave it in time for some questions as well. And so let me start with giving some disclaimers and cautions. Bottom right, that would be one of the thousands of memorials one can find everywhere throughout Ukraine. That one I took near Glory Park in Kyiv. And to the left, that is a very representative market that's somewhere between the city of Lviv and a town called Steichi, just for your knowledge. So who am I and who I'm not? So, and what I did in Ukraine. I was part of the Department of National Defense response to Euromaidan's invasion. I no longer work for the military. I no longer work for the Department of National Defense, and I do not speak on their behalf. I need to be make that very, very clear. I was there chiefly to do liaison missions between the Ukrainian government and the government of Canada. Although NATO partners, although Ukraine is not part of NATO, NATO did have response teams that would train some of their forces. And my job was, in a way, to sort of get everyone to play nice. So what needs Ukraine would have in a part of the world versus in other parts of the country, excuse me, what the Americans, the British, what we could provide. My job was sort of to be the go-between of that. My views are my own. I just mentioned that briefly. I don't represent the government of Canada. I do not represent Harvard University or the University of Manitoba. If I take the U of M and Harvard, nice and wonderful as they are, I don't speak on their behalf. And it's important to know that. Okay. And as I mentioned, I'm an outsider. I'm not Canadian. I'm not Ukrainian. I'm Canadian. And so my view is very much tailored on my origins. I'm originally from Montreal. So I'm a bilingual guy from Eastern Canada. And that will reflect the tinted lens that I had when I was in Ukraine. So it's important to keep that in perspective too. And as Senator Desko explained, what I wrote occurred before the 2022 invasion. I have never set foot in Luhansk or Donetsk. I've set foot pretty much everywhere else in Ukraine, though those are two areas that I never walked into. It's important to know that what I'm going to be mentioning and talking about now is reflective of what happened prior to February of this year. This is very important to me, although thank you, Yulia, for mentioning it. I make absolutely no money from this book. I make zero profit. 100% is donated to Ukrainian charities. This matters to me greatly, as it would appear when this got published that it coincided with the Russian Federation invading Ukraine. I can assure you that was coincidental, and I would never, on the heels of horror, try to profit from what's going on in Ukraine. I need to, for my own edification and just for everyone to know very much why I wrote this. My time in Ukraine is very much likely over. However, I asked myself, how best could I help? I thought perhaps highlighting Ukraine as I saw it and honoring what I saw in a matter-of-fact, straightforward way would be the best way to. And so these profits are mainly going to an orphanage near Lviv called Number 2 Orphanage. I say this nicely, Ukrainians are not that creative named sometimes, so it's number 1, number 2, number 3. So be it. And so I wrote this book to highlight the struggles and offer some. And lastly, I need to make this point extra clear. This is please, if you buy my book, oh right, I'll do the sales pitch once and I'll never do it again, I swear. If you're interested in contributing to this, you can find my book on Amazon.ca. If you just write my name, Alexandre Fontaine, or Talking to Ukrainians, it's right there. I kept it as low as possible. And the reason why it's published through Amazon and Kindle and not through the traditional Library of Canada option of first edition, second edition, is that the return on profit is just such a higher. And because I did this for fundraising, I chose the medium in which it would generate the most funds. So that's the last time I'll do it. Amazon.ca, my name, if you'd like to help. And that. If you buy my book, you'll see that this is the first thing that you'll find. I feel it's important for me to read it. The following is dedicated to the people of Ukraine. Much as I've tried to explain my point of view as neutrally as possible, I understand that what I wrote will be criticized. I want to clarify that any negative comments on the Russian Federation, by no means a criticism of Russians as a people. For those of you who are not from Ukraine, or do not have Ukrainian origin, and you're an outsider looking in, one could be interested in thinking that Ukraine would have a problem with Russians as a people. I cannot emphasize the emphasis enough how that is not true. If we look at the war fighting in Ukraine right now, the vast majority of people that are fighting in the Ukrainian military are Russian speakers, are culturally Russian, and are just as Ukrainian as someone who is Ukrainian by language and by culture. It would be like saying that I have loyalty to England because I speak English, or France because I speak French. There is very little from what I saw down there in terms of division. And one thing that Ukrainians would always tell me is that we are not Yugoslavia. We are not going to become Yugoslavia. We are not going to have divides, or we are not going to have people that used to get along despise each other once more. They use Yugoslavia as something else. And so what I'm going to be telling you right now is please keep in mind that criticisms that I will leverage have nothing to do with Russian or Russian culture. I feel that's very important to mention. Now, with a series of disclaimers and who I am done, let's begin. So let's start with Ukrainian mindsets, which I have to mention briefly in that one needs to understand something about Ukraine before you can have conversations with people that are Ukrainian. The first thing to know about Ukraine, and I'm putting this as lightly as I can, is that history has been extremely unkind to Ukraine. Ukraine has, in one way or another, for the last 100 years, been under control of, depending on how one sees it, the Germans, the Russians, then Russian hegemony. If we go back far enough, the Polish Empire. Ukraine has not had, to put it lightly, a good go. Intermined by genocide, which by Canada included, qualifies and counts as genocide in the 1930s. That was followed by the Second World War, where at one point, 1 Ukrainian out of 16 perished at the height of that war. To give you an idea of how many losses there were in the Second World War in Ukraine, there was even more of them in Ukraine than there were in what we now call the Russian Federation. And then we can insert an economic decline in the 1990s. That was the war. History's been unkind to Ukraine. And the result of that is that Ukraine is not like most other European nations. So it's not like Germany or, say, Poland, where they were both controlled by the USSR, well, Eastern Germany was, for 50 years. But when the wall fell, what exactly is Germany? Well, that's easy to explain. You can go and define by language and by background, etc. What exactly is Poland? Well, they also have had their own pope and they have their own background, et cetera, et cetera. But Ukraine as a country was controlled by the Soviets for so long that what exactly Ukraine looked like without being controlled by the USSR was not in lived memory anymore. It's important to know that. In 1991, who alive would remember what Ukraine looked like as a sovereign state that wasn't being controlled by the USSR? Nobody. So Ukraine had a very different start, and it's not like most European nations in that when they achieved independence from the USSR or from other empires, they didn't have quite a solid definition of their own identity and of their own nationhood before there was foreign occupation or foreign control. See it this way, it's kind of like Canada. Americans have a very clear definition of what an American is. What's a Canadian? That's a little harder to define. Can't be defined. It's a little harder. My point here is telling you is that keeping in mind here, Ukraine is not like most European nations. And I'll end it with the control of the USSR to illustrate to you how much control did the USSR have in Ukraine. It was, Ukraine, the third largest nuclear power on Earth after the fall of the Soviet Union. If you were to take every nuclear weapon from France and the United Kingdom and China, and you were to put them together, that was very pale in comparison to. Imagine how much control the USSR must have had in Ukraine to trust that amount of nuclear stockpiles within Ukraine. And I need you to keep that in mind because that level of control generates a Soviet legacy that you see everywhere. And this legacy, I would, based on some of my colleagues that have lived in the Russian Federation, odds are the Soviet legacy in Ukraine is even more present now than it would be in Russia. And I'll talk about why that is in a moment. So moving on to the mindset now with that backdrop. The first thing that you need to know is the level of stubbornness that Ukrainians have, or as I would put it more politely, determined. I write in my book a few examples of individuals. One is Piotr, another one is Sasha, where I'll give you one good example. The man was a suit maker and he was a tailor. He owned a business of about 40 people in Kyiv, not too far from where I took that photo. That photo is very close to Glory Park in Kyiv. And when Russian Federation invaded in 2014 through proxy, he left his business, he left his very high-paying job to join the Ukrainian military, making about 40 USD a month. And his only regret is he didn't do it earlier. Like really, that's what you're going to see in Ukraine. These are not people that put water in their wine. Very, very persistent, very determined. And when I asked him, well, do you have any regrets? He goes, yeah, I should have done it earlier. Okay. Because of the economic situation, because of this Soviet mentality of distrust, what happens is you will find the Ukrainians are extremely distrustful of all. And I don't blame them. If you're not born with them, as in to say in their village, you didn't go to school with them, they're nice to you, they're very kind, don't get me wrong. They're very distrustful of the intentions of others. And that's because you had a state that was under the Soviet control where everyone, what you said and what you did really did matter. So if you would say something that was offensive to the state, there were real consequences. That generational mentality has, to a certain extent, perpetuated itself, which brings us to that glass ceiling effect. One man that I was talking to a lot, his name was Sasha. Sasha was a hotel manager that wasn't too far from a city called Lviv. He was an engineer by trade. He was about 5 years younger than me, so, early late 20s. And he was an engineer. He studied at Lviv's Polytechnic in engineering. Very smart guy. And he was working at a hotel. And he is lucky, in fact, very lucky that he got that job. Why? It doesn't matter how well he did in school. It doesn't matter how smart he is. What matters is who he knows and the money he has. That is a mentality that you have from what they refer to as a glass ceiling. People over the age of 60 in Ukraine are used to a Soviet-style mentality of bribes, corruption, who you know, nepotism, half-truths, but that's a legacy of the USSR. And so for people that are, call it 55, 60 or over, it's not that they do this on purpose, they just don't know how to do it any other way. And then you have people that are my age or younger, which are wildly more open-minded, clearly aware of what the problems are in Ukraine. And they notice that they have this glass ceiling effect where you have an older generation that while they're really trying to do a different way, they don't know how. And so this older generation does not like the new. One example, there's a police force in Ukraine where by polling, 5% approval rate, because they're all corrupt and pretty much so corrupt that it became difficult for them to do their job. The Ukrainian nation understood this. Like the Ukrainian government under Poroshenko, so that would be the president before President Zelensky, said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make a new police force with one criteria. Everyone has to be under the age of 30. And no one could have ever been in the other police force. And the result, by polling, 95% approval. So the Ukrainian nation, they get the problems that they have and they're working on it, but you do have that glass ceiling effect from a legacy of the Soviet Union. And that brings me to talking about the generational difference, which I assure you is very large. If I was to walk, or someone younger than me was to walk in downtown Kyiv, see here, or Lviv, I assure you that the mentality that people have there is very comparable to what you'd see in Canada. The difference, though, between those who were born after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the difference between 1991 prior and after is just tremendous. And that is a real problem for Ukraine. And of course, the other thing too is because you still have this mentality in fields of power, people are suspicious and I wouldn't go so far as to say they're very fatalistic, though they're far happier with the little that they have. Like, these are not people that strive to have PhDs if they're from a farming community. It is a sort of Soviet cynicism legacy of a day gone by. But now, if I take their values and ethics, what I really want to get into by discussing. So here's a few examples of conversations I've had, all in the book. One is with a man called Piotr. Piotr was a young officer in the Ukrainian military, about 25 or 26, and a Canadian that I was working with, not poorly intentioned, just his preparation on how he was going to talk to him was a solid app. So he goes to Piotr and he says, I have hundreds of sets of clothing, socks, boots, equipment needed for Ukrainian service personnel, and I know that yours could need them. Would you like them? The reaction of this young Ukrainian officer is, no, thank you. I have all I need. Even though the winter in Ukraine is very comparable to Canada, at least Canada. And so this Canadian comes back to me, he's like, I don't get it. Why would he not accept this equipment? And I go, well, the reason for that is you didn't appreciate enough how important pride is for them. Not arrogance, but pride. Because to his mind, what you did was you went up and you said something like, Piotr, I know that my country can provide more for yours in a day than yours could do in 6 months. So how about you take all of this, because I'll make you look extra weak in front of your guys. Of course he's going to. That may sound familiar in Canada, though I can assure you in Ukraine, you're going to have far, far more resistance. What do I do? Well, go back to him and go, Piotr, can I ask you for some advice? And, yeah, what can I help you with? Well, I have a surplus of equipment, and I'm not quite sure how I can share this with allies in this case. Can you tell me how I best go about that? And what Piotr will do is he will give you a song and dance that will bore you to a point that'll make paint dry. He'll explain, the processes of Ukrainian logistics and whatever. And then you'll say, well, can I ask you for a favor? And he'll go, yeah. Well, could I give it to you and you could distribute it as best you see fit? And he said yes. Now, he's not stupid. Don't get me wrong here. He knows exactly what you're doing. You're giving him that cultural out, which is very required, I saw in Ukrainians. It's very important for them to have that sort of presentation. Which brings me to my second story, which is iPhones. And for an outsider, that this piece is critical. When one goes to a large city, so if you go to Kyiv or if you go to Lviv or Kyiv, you will see people that are very well dressed, that wear shoes, by which I mean shoes that you shine, not running shoes. They wear running shoes and they go running. Pants that they iron, and you'll see that there's iPhones everywhere. Like, everyone has an iPhone. And for the outsider, what you're doing is you're going like, well, wait a minute here. Isn't Ukraine poor? Like, isn't the average salary like $300 a month? Why are there iPhones everywhere? Well, that's because iPhones are just as expensive in Ukraine as they are here. In fact, they're a little more expensive. People will save up for 9 months to buy one. And it's not gloating. It's not out of arrogance. It's that their sense of appearance, how they show themselves to others, it's synonymous with their sense of self-worth. In North America, we have, both in Canada and the United States, I would think we're unique in that we can pretty much dress however we want. In Europe, for those of you who've been to Europe, you don't wear a pair of jeans, running shoes, and a t-shirt when you go to see your grandmother. You dress a little more properly. You find that in Ukraine, men open the car doors when they get out of the car. When you're going on a street and there's a funeral procession and there's a hearse going by, I've seen this in Kyiv, where there's a lot of traffic. If the hearse is going by, people stop their cars, turn the engine off, get out, take their hat off, and wait for the person to go by. They're that respectful. And so the iPhone it's not really a status symbol. It goes with what they should be. So if I take Sasha, who's somebody who worked at that hotel, he would be impeccably dressed. He has 2 suits, 3 shirts, one pair of pants, he'll arrange it so it looks differently, but it's very, very important for them that the way that they appear and the way that they present themselves is representative of their feelings of self-worth. It's not like here where you can dress wherever you want. Like in Ukraine, they would almost see us as slobs, I think, in many cases. Like you wouldn't dress like that. If you go to university in Ukraine, you'll see that they're wearing collared shirts and there are no frosh parties. They're there to study. So the iPhone is just, it's not a status symbol. It's a symbol of what people need to do in order to have a sense of self-worth. And useless lawns. Now, this is probably more representative of rural Ukraine. I spent about 3 months going through the same area that would connect Lviv to Kyiv. And I would stop in this small village every time. And there was a young woman, about 14 years old, her name was Anna, and she was working in a store that was owned by her grandfather. And I would stop there, I'd have tea, you know, back when I used to smoke cigarettes, you know, my conversations with Anna were essentially Dobre den, va, Parliament Blue, Voda, Idva, Voda, Zigazon, Badlaska, you know, kind of some cigarettes and fizzy water. That's where it was the first couple of months. But over time, what happened was her grandfather, you know, I get that he was suspicious of me, as they all tend to be, saw me reading a children's book in Ukrainian, because I was trying to learn to read and write it a little instead of just speaking it. And so I needed something simple. And so the grandfather goes, why are you reading that? Through Anna, who spoke English. Like, well, I'd like to learn something about Ukraine. He's like, oh, do you want to tea? Like, yes. And I had a series of conversations with Anna's grandfather, from their past to their identity to what's important for Ukrainians from an older generational perspective. I thought was very, very useful. And the useless lawns started with Anna, and this, I think, is very Ukrainian. She says to me, why do you grow lawns? I'm like, lawns? Grass? Why do we grow grass? And she goes, yes, why do you grow a completely useless shrub that does nothing at all aside from be green and flat? And I thought about it, like, why do we grow lawns? Well, in Ukraine, you don't have much of that. You know what you'll have vegetable patches. We have flower gardens, or you'll have something like they do things with the stuff that they have. They're a lot closer to, they're not consumers like we are. Most of her clothing, the beautiful patterns, typical Ukrainian clothing, are made by her grandmother. At her shop, most of the tables are made by her grandfather and her father. Most of the things that she would sell there, it was either baked by her immediate family, or they were found in a local market. They're a lot closer to the things that they consume and to the things that they make. It's not like it's not a consumerist, you buy as much as you can society. And I'm convinced, even if they had a lot of money, I don't think that they would be at the same level we are. They take a lot of pride in making stuff, which I think is a big difference from where Canada is, in my opinion. And now I'll talk briefly about obstacles. So I'll start with, you'll see in a moment how this makes sense. I'll talk about obstacles that unfortunately Ukraine has to deal with and only Ukraine can, and then I'll talk about the elephant in the room. So the first one is that corruption is endemic. Right now, we have nothing but empathy and nothing but respect for Ukraine and the impossible situation we're going through. One day when this is over, Ukraine will have to admit that corruption is a really large problem. Members of parliament are often viewed as the same thing as a criminal, except they have a good title and pension that's by the state. And it is a real problem in Ukraine that no one can fix it but Ukrainians. I will give you one story to explain the problem with Ukraine when it comes to bureaucracy. It comes with life makes no sense, or bureaucracy makes no sense. Lviv International is a nice airport. I go there with luggage, passport, e-ticket. Great. Go to the first counter. Go there, like, hello, hi. Are you taking the plane today? Yes, miss, I'm taking the plane. Okay, do you have any luggage? It's right there. Yes, miss, I have. Okay, have your e-ticket and passport. She looks at it for about 10 minutes, just checking something on the screen. Have your luggage card. Luggage card. Yeah, you need a luggage card for your luggage. You just give me one. She looks at me like, no, you have to go to the Other department where they do luggage is only luggage. Okay, so I go there. Hi. Are you taking the plane? Yes. Okay. Do you have luggage? Yes. You have your luggage card? Yes. Okay, luggage card. Oh, wait, she looks in for 10 minutes. Oh, wait, you're going outside of Ukraine. You need another luggage card. Well, okay, can you give me that luggage card? Well, no, I can't give you that luggage card. You have to go to that one over there and go get your luggage card. Go back. Hi, are you in Canada? I'll spare you an hour and 15 minutes later. I have 8 forms, 7 which are stamped before I get to customs. If I can convey to you the Soviet bureaucracy in one quick story, it would be taking a plane at Lviv International. Give you an idea, if you go to a restaurant in Ukraine, most of them have a stamp on the menu because you couldn't have a menu without a properly approved stamp from the city. You have that. And that sort of Tower of Babel phenomenon is something that Ukraine simply has to fix on their own. There's really nothing that a foreigner can do about it. I will talk about the heroes in 1 minute. If that photo at the bottom right, if you think that's a joke, it's actually serious. There's a bureaucrat somewhere in Kyiv that thought that if they didn't have signs for people going to the bathroom, that they'd rip the toilets out of the tile and carry them on their back. It's not even a joke. It's still funny to me when I look at that, but that's the problem with Ukrainian Soviet-inspired bureaucracy, is that you'll see things all over that city that make absolutely no sense. And it's not because Ukrainians are stupid. They're not stupid at all. Their bureaucracy, however, is far beneath them, to put it too polite. And heroes are dated. That is an obstacle. Yeah, we can all name Zelensky, sure. But what figure exactly in the 20th century can we have in Ukraine that's universally liked by everyone? It's not Bandera. That also is something. Ukraine does have an obstacle in that identity, real identity for Ukraine. While they do have one, their heroes are dated. And I feel that what they're going through right now, if there's one positive that will come out of this, is that you will have more heroes that they do need to create on their own. And I'll end with this. This used to be my office. That is at the Yavoriv Training Center. I would work there all the time with the British, Ukrainians, the Americans. And it is not lost to me that when the Russian Federation invaded, I realized that Twitter shows March 13th. It was actually struck about a week and a half before that. One of the first things that the Russian Federation decided to attack in the western part of Ukraine was the Yavoriv Training Center, which has absolutely no strategic value. Ukrainian military doesn't have much equipment at all there. It is where NATO forces were located to help Ukraine through these difficult times. I think looking at that, the message is very clear. I could have been there very easily. The Russian Federation, and that brings me to the elephant, is of course the obstacle that Ukraine has, I think, shockingly done very well in defending its nation and defending its homeland. Yulia and I were talking briefly before this presentation started. I am of the firm belief that victory for Ukraine equals democracy. Every generation we find something that's a symbol of things to come. All the Berlin Wall is one. The end of the Second World War is another. Ukraine will decide the fate of the world. I don't mean to sound theatric, nor do I mean to sound fatalistic. Ukraine is the last sigh of the Russian Federation that's nostalgic of the period of the USSR. And make no doubt about it, China is looking at every second what's happening in Ukraine to what the free world will do. And I think that what we're doing right now is the right thing, to the tune of billions of dollars if need be, to provide support for Ukraine. And it is a model to the free world. Ukraine is the size of Texas, roughly. And to compare Ukraine with the Russian Federation militarily, it would be like comparing the United States to Canada. There is no comparison. And yet, look at what they've been doing. Look at how determined they are. I write in my book at the last chapter that there are no ends of stories of smaller nations that win over time, so long as they're never willing to give up. It's often surprising to some of my colleagues that the first time the White House, US Congress were burned to the ground wasn't, well, I should say Congress, was burned to the ground wasn't a few years ago. It was in the War of 1812, when my ancestors fought off an American army that was 20 times their size. Our president then, former President Jefferson, thought it would be a few weeks of marching to take Canada. And 2 years later, the White House is on fire, Congress on fire, US Treasury is on fire, and these powerful men ask themselves, how could this have ever happened? I see Ukraine as very similar in that sense. China couldn't do it to Vietnam, the British couldn't do it to Ireland, the Soviets couldn't do it to Finland. I see no reason why it'll be any different from Ukraine. And so this is my traditional stopping point. I'd just like to thank you very much for your time and for your patience. And I'll fib a little, Amazon.ca, talking to Ukrainians, Alex Fontaine, if you'd like to donate to a noble cause. At least I think. Okay, and so I'm done for now. If there's any questions, I'd be more than happy to take them.
Thank you, Alexander, for this insightful presentation. Before the full-scale invasion of 2022, I would say that stories of average Ukrainians were rarely being told. And your work predates the full-scale invasion, which makes it especially interesting, and yet it did not lose relevancy and even predicted, in a way, what was about to happen. And I'd like to share a quote that stood out to me. Quoting, "Despite all of this, the fighting in the anti-terrorist operation is not the summum of Ukraine. One day it too will prove to be no more than a chapter in their long, difficult history, and remembered, I suspect, as a footnote compared to conflicts far more deadly." Well, now I'd like to open the floor for discussion. Feel free to submit your questions into the chat box or simply raise your hand and I will be happy to call on you to ask your questions if you'd like. While everyone is getting their thoughts together, I'll start with a question that I was wondering about. So Alexander, you have stated in the book that removing Russian as a national language in Ukraine was a mistake, as it was a misservice to culturally Russian and yet patriotic Ukrainians. Could you please walk us through your logic and explain your thinking? And I'd also be curious to hear if your opinion has changed with the 2022 full-scale invasion.
It has not changed. In fact, I think it's even more important that that not have been done. The background is a few years ago, President Poroshenko, before President Zelensky, used to be that Ukraine had two official languages, Ukrainian and Russian. And the idea was to remove Russian as a national language. For reasons I suspect that were very political. I understand why he did that. I understand the logic of it. I can appreciate distancing oneself from a far larger behemoth that has made Ukraine's survival very difficult. Excuse me. Yet that does no service to the millions of patriotic Ukrainians that so happen to be Russian speakers, that so happen to be culturally Russian. The Ukrainian military operates in Russian today. The vast majority of people that were fighting in Kyiv is a Russian. Even Kyiv, frankly, is largely for business in Russia. I think it's very important to parse Russian as a language and Russian as a culture from the Russian Federation. And I think that by removing Russian as a national language in Ukraine, that does no service at all to the millions of patriotic Ukrainians that are Russian speakers. So the 2022 invasion, no, that hasn't changed. One's never supposed to say that's a very good question. Having said that, Yulia, that's a very good question. No, it hasn't changed my view on that at all. I don't want to give the Russian Federation any munitions towards why they're doing what they're doing in Ukraine. And of the very few propaganda wins that Ukraine has ever given to the Russian Federation, that was one of them, where it's still touted every day by the Kremlin. Well, you see, they remove Russian. Look, they're oppressing the Russian minority, and they're using that against the interests of Ukraine. So no, I don't. My mind hasn't changed.
Thank you, Alexander. And we have a follow-up question from Danilo Poliloyev-Schmidt. So could you please explain to us why perhaps you have chosen to separate the state from the nation, and how would you prevent linguicide of the Ukrainian language?
How would I prevent languicide? Well, this from the Ukrainian language. Okay, so let's take these one piece at a time. So how would I prevent, how would I think would be prevented languicide, and how do I parse? First, Ukrainian institutions of higher learning are very impressive. Considering the state has little means, Ukrainian institutions have no appetite to anglicize themselves, no appetite to Russify themselves. Ukrainian institutions of higher learning are in Ukrainian, and the state is very clear they will remain in Ukrainian. There is no appetite at all to go down another route. The state clearly is emphasizing Ukrainian in its language education and its health services. And while Russian is an option, generally speaking, Ukrainian business within Ukraine operates in Ukrainian, unless it's amongst other Russian speakers. And so the state has given it quite a good push. For example, under the Soviet Union, it was controversial to even speak Ukrainian. I would have interpreters that would be in their 60s saying, if you were in Kyiv and you were outside of a university, the one that used Ukrainian, it was almost controversial to speak Ukrainian. I fully understand that there was, if the Berlin Wall had not fallen, the Soviet Union would have kept another 30 years. Would Ukrainian still be a language in Ukraine? I think it would be almost folkloric. I get that. Yet, that's not the case anymore. Ukrainian as a language demographically has increased. Ukrainian is no longer viewed as secondary or tertiary, even in very Russian-speaking areas. It has attained equality amongst even the Russian minority. And as a majority language, Ukrainian is the language of the state. I see it like in Canada, French is an official language. Si je commence à parler en français here, I don't expect anyone to understand it. I kind of see that sort of federation mentality that Ukrainians do have now, we simply maintain. So how would I avoid languicide? I feel that the state is already so clear on the language that it uses and on the language. It's not because Russian is an official language that it will be used everywhere. It's simply recognized, just like in Canada, right? So I don't think, based on what the state's doing, that Ukrainian is in any danger of being marginalized. And if anything, the data has shown the opposite, especially since President Pavlichenko will come to power. As for how do I parse from the state, the short answer to that is identity. Well, it's one. If I can just take one at a time, I'll answer that one right after. How do I parse language from society or language from state? Well, that falls under identity. In the same way of how do I parse between the United States and Canada, identity. I think that was a mistake the Russian Federation did when they thought that they would come to Kyiv and that people would greet them as liberators. Well, how wrong they were, that's through identity. So I don't need to, or I don't think anyone needs to explain to Kyiv why they are Ukrainian. They are Ukrainian. So I think the shorthand answer to that is, how do I parse it? Certainly not by language. I parse that by identity. And I know there was a follow-up one. I don't mean to.
Sorry that I interrupt. You were saying about Russian Federation and Russians that was kind of addressed to this question, because you said that we shouldn't mix, I'm sorry, the government and the people of Russia. So for me, it's a bit like that people of Russia build the state in which they're living in, so we kind of cannot divide it. But I really like your perspective when you are dividing, like why, and could you please explain this logic so I would understand it a bit deeper, because I saw this also in your book when I was reading it.
So it's a good question. I'm just honest. I think it would be fair to say that Russia, the Russian Federation, is right now is woefully unrepresentative of Russians. The top 40 wealthiest Russians in Russia own more than everyone else. Retirement pensions in Russia, one is eligible for them if you're a man 2 years after you die, on average. I don't believe the state in the Russian Federation is representative in any way of Russians as a people. I believe that there are a few oligarchs who are, to use a term of art, milking the cow of the Russian state to their own interests. Though to call what we see in the Russian Federation right now as representative of Russian society, I think is fanciful. I don't think that's fair for them. I would also add, if I was someone in the Russian Federation right now, I would keep my mouth shut too. Right now, we've got 47 politicians, municipal politicians, that are all under arrest as of 2 days ago. Their crime, that they suggested that President Putin might want to think of doing something else. People live in fear in that country. People don't have the right to express themselves. It is a crime in Russia to even write something that isn't representative of state apparatus and the apparatchiks that run that country. I take your point, though I don't think that the construct I'm seeing as a Russian Federation is representative of people or language or culture. I think, and it's important to make that distinction. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm really sorry because I really wanted to take part in this discussion and I was going with train, so that's why I wasn't answering immediately. Yeah, it partially does because, you know, I was trying to kind of see the parallels also with other regimes, like, for example, with fascists in Italy or with Nazis in Germany. And after the Second World War, kind of the whole nation was responsible for what happened. And then looking at the, when you also mentioned cultural aspect, by looking like 20 years ago, 30 years ago, this infamous publication from Solzhenitsyn, when he says that Ukraine doesn't exist and that Russia should take away all the territories it gave to Ukraine. And then we have Brodsky, who publishes anti-Ukrainian poem. So I kind of also see that Russian culture imposed, even those people who were against communism and so on, they still imposed kind of very anti-Ukrainian narrative. And for me, it's kind of hard to divide it from what's happening right now, because they kind of build the base for all the hatred and also invasion. But yeah, but it's important for me to hear other points of view and all the criticism which was throughout the book, which is, I think, very valuable for Ukrainians.
Thank you, Danilo, for your point. And we have some other questions to proceed with. So Dr. Petrosian is interested to find out whether you think that Anglophones and Francophones see Ukraine in the same terms, or are there any differences?
Yes. Francophones, I'm half-half. So my father's French Canadian, my mother's English Canadian. So French Canada is naturally more sensitive to issues of identity and language for reasons, I think, that are quite obvious. So I would think that when Francophones are visiting or living in Ukraine, that Ukraine chose to serve, maintain, and reinforce its own language and values was deeply impressive for me, especially. I would have thought naively before I set foot in Ukraine that the universities were going to anglicize themselves like many countries do, thinking that English is a solution. No, Ukraine, no, it's in Ukrainian. Their institutions are Ukrainian. Why would they not be? And they're very high quality too, I might add. So I think French Canadians, when they look at Ukraine as a minority in many ways, at least in the world, I think that we're impressed, very impressed, because we've seen a lot of countries, a lot of languages in North America that have died out because people have simply thought they're not important. That people that were the guarantors of their own culture and their own background didn't view it as important. and that Ukraine views it as very important. I think, especially with the limited resources they have, I think most French Canadians that have worked in Ukraine would agree with me. It's very impressive that they chose the right thing over the simple. As for English Canadians, I don't think that they view this as a bad thing either. I think that the lens that they have is more probably less value or less importance on culture, because I don't think the majority usually think such things as much. Just not, that's not a criticism, it's really just an observation. I think English Canadians will look at it more on an economic model than French Canadians will look at it more for one, if that answers your question.
Thank you so much, Alexander. And is there anything that you would like to have changed or added to the book if you were writing it today?
I took away the stories that were the most uncomfortable. I realized that the audience I was writing for are generally people in Canada, and some of the realities in Ukraine would be very difficult. I speak of poverty for people in Canada to understand. I didn't whitewash what I wrote. I didn't put on, I make that very clear at the start of what I wrote. I didn't do the typical Canadian thing, which is to dress up a bad situation and look at the bright side. I wrote about what I saw in as honest a way I could, without putting on rose-tinted glasses or making it seem worse than it is. I tried as best I could to honor the people I saw by conveying as accurately the things that I saw. Yet there were a few instances of stories which involved real poverty. And while in what I wrote might appear grim, I can assure there were things that are far grimmer that I didn't put in there, because I don't know that the point that I was trying to make would get across more if I would have done so. Having said that, would I have added anything more? I think I would have added a few more conversations I had with people that were more in the East if I would go back. But certainly I would not, everything that I wrote, there's nothing in there I would have removed.
Thank you, Alexander, for this comprehensive answer. You have pointed out in your book, and you've just mentioned also, that history has been unkind to Ukraine. And you've devoted a significant portion of the book to stories of average Ukrainians, quite different people from various walks of life, with a common trait, their ability to overcome and withstand hardship. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what makes Ukrainians the way they are, and how are they similar or different compared to other countries, other neighbors, perhaps?
Growth is pain, right? Growth is supposed to hurt. It's supposed to toughen your skin. It's supposed to, it's not supposed to be a pleasant experience, growing. I'm not saying it's supposed to be wretchedly miserable, though it's not supposed to be delightful. I think anybody living in Ukraine understands that they will really have, if they're lucky, they will have maybe 1 or 2 attempts at being successful, being a little bit better. And there are no second, in a country where there are no second chances, people take the first chance very seriously. So if I can take universities, for example, the idea of especially an American university, of frosh parties and Greek clubs and what have you would never see that. One of the most, if there was only one thing I could do with all of you right now, was to bring you into Lviv Polytechnic, 5 minutes, 5 minutes, where you walk in and this is what you will see. I'm going in a roundabout way, your question, bear with me, I'm getting there. If you go to Lviv Polytechnic, we'll see an impeccably clean building. You will not see ads or posters all over the wall. You will not see invites to frosh parties. You will not see people that are on their cell phones that are talking on TikTok. You're going to see people that are very, very polite, that are going from one classroom to the next, that are quiet, that are not running, that are taking this very seriously, because there is no second chance. There is no attempt to do it again. You're given that one opportunity. Don't waste it. And they know it. So when you have that mentality. It's not one of desperation here. Let's be clear. It's one of, this is it. Don't blow it. There's many others who would love this. We told once. And with that sort of backdrop, you get people that are very disciplined, or very persistent, I'd say is the better word than discipline. And so I think that molds a Ukrainian mind a great deal. And so I think that goes a long way to explaining how they act and why they act the way they do. Have I answered that, or did I miss a piece in there?
Thank you, Alexandre. That's really astute. And I suppose I have one last quote to share. So quoting, "To the government of the Russian Federation, I'd suggest the moment of pause. If generations of control, either directly or by puppets, did not quash Ukrainian identity, language, or beliefs, I would suggest that this might be a hint that they will never go away. If mass starvations, war, forceful annexation, criminalizing opinions, censoring identities, bribing their officials has not diminished the resolve of Ukrainians, there's a lesson to be learned." Quote ended. I wish that the leadership of the Russian Federation could have comprehended the lesson. It could have saved a lot of innocent lives that are taken by this unprovoked aggression. Thank you, Alexandre, so much for your work and for allowing us to pick your brain here today. For those who have not yet had a chance to read the book, do make sure to familiarize yourself with this great piece. And thank you so much to everyone for joining us here today. And do stay tuned for more events in the future.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Good evening.